The next guy I'm introducing is probably our creative director, the creative spirit of our experience at MacArthur. Bill Celaya has done 2 videos that we've all seen, we've all enjoyed, that are massive amount of work created with the music, with the photographs, with the interviews of classmates. Bill's been just an important part of everything that we've ever done. I'd like to share a couple of stories just so we see a little of the personal side of who Bill is. He used to be the stage manager at Austin City Limits. He said that he is a pissing buddy of Willie Nelson. One time, and that he's met a lot of these people. He's the guy telling them over there. He met Ray Charles. Says he introduced Diane Cannon to Ray Charles. Still waters run deep, and Bill is deep. And what legitimately he's done included the part of the recording. He was part of the recording team for the Happy Jazz Band that was broadcast over PBS and has been replayed many, many years. That show for PBS has now been archived at Stanford University. I mean, that's how good Bill Celaya is. I'd like to introduce him and turn tonight's program over to him.
Okay, I think everybody here can relate to this next little story. Follow me. They're these 2 middle-aged couples, maybe 67, 68 years old. They're having a little dinner party at one of the houses. And the wives are in the kitchen, and they're getting the dinner working, and the husbands are out front having their cocktails. And the host husband, he says, "Oh, last week we had this terrific meal. We found this new restaurant. The food was fabulous. The service was impeccable. The ambiance was just amazing. It was just a great evening." And so the guest husband, he says, "Well, what's the name of this restaurant?" And the host husband, what's the name of that flower that the stem's got those thorns on it? And the guest says, "Rose?" So, yeah, Rose. Hey, Rose, what was the name of that restaurant? You been there? You done that? You know, you're calling your child and you're using all the dogs' names. Well, I know everybody's tired because they got up early to watch the big royal wedding, you know. So Mark Gainey actually went. His flight just got in. It was amazing. He's got rice in his hair. Check him out. Remember this one? We are mighty, we are great. We're the class of 68. I had a couple of good ones for the class of 69, but I'll save those. Well, last night, many of us were at the Magic Time Machine for the Friday night event. And I thought, what if we actually had a magic time machine? We could go back 50 years and get a close look at who we were back then and what kind of world we were living in. You know, can you just quickly picture in your mind who you were back there in high school? Were you a fun person? Were you studious? Were you an athlete? A musician? Were you shy? Me, I kind of think of myself as the invisible dude. You know, I didn't get a whole lot of accolades. You know, probably most of you didn't have a clue who I was back in school, and probably still don't. And that's fine. That's fine. But what was your must-see TV back in the day? Laugh-In, Gunsmoke, The Monkees, Smothers Brothers, Hawaii Five-0, Gilligan's Island, Ed Sullivan, Mission Impossible, Soupy Sales. And what about the bands? Were you Beatles or Stones? Oh, really? Yeah, really. Then we had the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, James Brown. Yeah. Good God. Did you have a secret crush back in school? You know? I don't have enough hands. You know? Is that crush here tonight? By any chance? Just saying. You know? But don't you wish you knew back then what you know now? You know, just a little bit. I mean, I could have been king, you know? But, and all those what ifs, you know? What if? You know, you can think of your life as being like a stew. You keep adding ingredients and you keep changing the flavor of it, and it gets richer with more and more ingredients. You know, your genetics, of course, plays a big part in who you are, but also the experiences you encounter, the things that come in and go out of your life make a big difference in shaping who you are. Now, you look at the generic person who grows up in this country. We all have very common experiences, like our family, our friends, our classmates, our college life, our spouse number 2, our spouse number 3. Anyone? Don't be fat. My older brother, he's gone through 4 marriages. You know, but your career, your children, those are things that most anybody from any generation are going to encounter. But we were born at a special time in life, in the world. And everybody says, yeah, our generation was special. But I'm just going to walk you through a few of the things that we encountered, most of which you know. But I'm just trying to put this into a context of what ingredients went into our stew. You know, we were born in what they say interesting times. We were part of the baby boomer generation, which in itself was very unique. Raised with Depression-era parents. Did your parents save every single plastic bag they ever had, and every jar? You know, my mother had a garage full of jars and boxes, and you know, oh, that's a perfectly good paper towel. We can rinse it out and reuse it. You know, but think of it. They lived through World War II. You know, many of them fought in the war and certainly experienced that. And I can't imagine living with the specter of, wow, Hitler could actually pull this off, you know, and change the world. And thank God it had a happy ending. You know, we got out of it. But then we grew with the atomic bomb threat and the old tuck and cover and just that the bomb shelters. Did anybody grow up with a bomb shelter in the backyard? Boy, talk about the fun house, right? The mom, I'll be in the bomb shelter. You know. But then we had this amazing period of prosperity, and the suburbs spring up, and people are moving into the north side, the northeast area. We had Dr. Spock and his baby care book. Just what a world, you know. And the parents who had grown up during the Depression, they want their children to have everything and have all the best, for good or ill. That's what we've got, you know. But we were the first generation raised with a television in the front room, which blows my mind. You know, that kind of a thing. Radio's fine, but now we sit there. What was that show where you put the plastic sheet on the screen and you had to draw? Winky Dink, and the kids that didn't put the plastic on the screen, you know. But then along comes this world of Disney, and wow, for 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids. Suddenly you've got, remember Spin and Marty? Remember that show? Of course, the Mickey Mouse Club, and then the Davy Crockett thing. I remember counting down the days to when the Davy Crockett show with Fess Parker was going to air. And how nuts is that for those kids who were living in the Alamo City, to have this big spotlight on Fess Parker playing Davy Crockett and swinging old Betsy at those incoming Mexican army, crazy stuff. And then remember, half the shows on prime time are westerns. Boy, I sit and start naming them. Bonanza and Gunsmoke and Have Gun Will Travel and Paladin. On and on. Every night there was Sugarfoot. Is that Sugar? Wagon Train. Yeah, I'd watch that religiously. Then along comes the space program. Now you talk about blowing minds. We're going to go to the moon. And then you're watching, the Mercury program. Mercury, single guys going up and down. Gemini, two guys. Then Apollo. And with increasing frequency, you're watching this stuff on TV. Walter Cronkite calling the launch. And then they're broadcasting back, video. I was a bit of a wonk about that stuff, and I just loved it. I ended up meeting John Glenn, and I met a couple of the guys that walked on the moon. And my knees were shaking. I was just like, wow, you guys are rock stars. It was a big deal going to the moon, geez. But rock and roll really starts to change things. And for the first time, now we're starting to develop biculture. We had all grown up listening to our parents' music and watching our parents' TV and our sensibilities about the movies. And suddenly there's a split coming along. I remember being in the car and You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog came on, and my parents were like, you don't want to listen to that stuff. You don't want that Elvis thing, And I said, hell yeah. What's the deal? Here come the Beatles. And that was just the explosion. That was just like the Technicolor, door opens, and the whole British invasion really changed the world. Bob Dylan shows up, and he's writing sermons in his songs. It's just a whole new world that our parents never could fathom. And of course, the best music. David named a lot of that. That I don't care what people say. I think that was the best music that's come along in 50 years. And then here comes James Bond, James friggin' Bond. Just this time last week, in fact, literally this time last Saturday evening, I was watching Dr. No for the umpteenth time. Wow. But I think I would wager a bet that for most of you people, Goldfinger was your gateway drug. Probably the first James Bond, right? And that was also for me. I've got a sentimental, place in my heart for that. My first date was to go see Goldfinger. My brother had to drive us because we weren't old enough, and the date was with Becky Bailey. And I don't think she's here, but that lasted for a short period. I quickly proved I was not cut out to treat women with dignity, but I'd like to say 54 years later, I finally figured out, but that would be a lie. So think of the role model that James Bond suddenly here comes along, and these pimply faced, squeaky adolescent boys. That's a role model now. I'm going to be as suave as James Bond. Talk about impossible role models. And I started thinking, did women have something like that? A Brigitte Bardot or Julie Andrews, Doris Day, Barbarella. I don't know. But Mae West, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I'm asking. But things are really starting to speed up by the mid '60s. Youth movement is happening. Hippie culture starts appearing. The Beatles bring in the Eastern religions and the Maharishi. And suddenly, I can smell the incense. Just that whole that spice that's thrown into the stew. Here comes the drug culture, and behind all that, Vietnam is raging faster and harder and scarier. And of course, there's the pill. You know, uh, we were I wouldn't say the first, but early on, having that pill there just in case, just in case. And then you think about locally. We had Hemisphere, we had bicultural city, the Mexican culture apparent, and something I thought was interesting, all the military families that were in our area, MacArthur and such, and all the kids. I mean, all the kids. How many kids spent time overseas with their parents? You know, look what they brought to us. You know, plus they were kind of unique in their own way of learning how to make friends, and then your parents say we're moving, and you go to a new city and you start all over again, and you make new friends and you move again. That's just a very special ingredient thrown in the mix. But here locally we had Fiesta Week. Talk about nuts, you know. And then especially we had Mexican food and Lone Star beer, you know. Pearl. But the peak of the 60s was the year 1968. And here we are at ground zero for that as we're approaching our senior year in high school. And if you've noticed, there's been a lot written and a lot of TV, CNN and others, having their specials about the year the 50th anniversary of 1968. And back in January, as the year kicked off, Time magazine had a special issue about the year 1968. And John Meacham wrote, "We have embarked on the 50th anniversary of the year that stands with 1776, with 1861 and 1941, as points in time when everything in American history changed. As with the Declaration of Independence, the firing of Fort Sumter, and the attack on Pearl Harbor, the events of 1968 were intensely dramatic and lastingly consequential. From the assassination of Martin Luther King in April and of Robert Kennedy in June, to the violence of the Democratic National Convention in August, to the election of Richard Nixon in November, we live even now in the long shadow of the cascading crises of that year." And I think a lot of our politics is still an echo of that chasm that was beginning back in that era. Now, let's remember the spring and summer of our senior year, how tumultuous that was. If anybody was paying attention, watching the news or reading the paper or Time magazine, Tet Offensive in January, things ratchet up, and suddenly America has 550,000 troops in Vietnam. Now that's a war. And we watch the coverage every night on TV. You'd be eating dinner, and there's cameramen running around in the jungle capturing these firefights. It's unbelievable. You don't see that anymore. But we also saw the protests, the marches in Paris, and London, and New York, and cities across the country. In March 31st, LBJ withdraws, and he sets the stage for Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy to become the new faces of the Democratic Party. And 5 days later, on April 4th, Martin Luther King is gunned down, and the riots break out for many, many nights in more than 100 cities. Washington, D.C. is on fire. And you remember seeing that? Lord. And the next night, it's Chicago, it's Baltimore, it's New York. April 4th. And 2 days after that, April 6th, Hemisphere opens. And I don't know if you remember, but there was discussion whether we should do that. It was appropriate to launch such a festive event under the cloud of what was taking place in the country, but they went ahead and did it. And in late April, demonstrators at Columbia University take over the administration building. And 2 days after that, it happens at Ohio State. April 29th, the musical Hair opens on Broadway. And on June 5th, shortly after our graduation, Robert Kennedy's shot dead and changes the course of history. they say it was almost certain that Robert Kennedy would have been elected president, and we got Richard Nixon instead, and you can easily understand the contrast of those two administrations and how that would have affected the next several years in our country. And then on December 24th, Christmas Eve, do you remember watching three men in a small metal bucket orbiting the moon, reading from Genesis? Wow, what a year. I mean, any one of those events would have been historic. And here we were in the middle of our adolescence, preparing to graduate and go out in the real world. And this is just a daily thing going on, or periodically at least, going on. Now let's hop back in that magic time machine and go back half a century, exactly 50 years ago from this day, May 19, 2018. Go back to May 19, 1968. It was a Sunday. And on TV that Sunday evening was Bonanza, Smothers Brothers, Mission Impossible, and Ed Sullivan. And get this, on that Ed Sullivan show that night, Ed's guests were Joan Rivers, Joel Grey, the West Point Glee Club, and the Fifth Dimension. And the fifth, I can be real specific here. The Fifth Dimension performed Stone Soul Picnic. Surrey on down. What is Surrey anyway? Does anybody know what Surrey down? Also, the 20th Emmy Awards was on that night. And Get Smart won for Best Comedy and Mission Impossible for Best Drama. And of course, you remember we only had 4 TV channels back then. ABC, CBS, NBC, and it was NET. It eventually changed to PBS. But back in those days, NET, they had Julia Child was on back then. The French Chef. The number one song on that Sunday evening was Tighten Up by Archie Bell and the Drells. Now, I think that's real weird. In the middle of the Beatles and the Stones and the Doors, number one song is Archie Bell and the Drells? I don't know. Also playing was Honey by Bobby Goldsboro, Judy in Disguise with Diamonds, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. And the next number one song was to be Mrs. Robinson. The movie had been released back in December. And if you remember, we had like 2 radio stations. Were you a KTSA person or a KONO? Remember Ricky Ware and Bruce Hathaway? Beatles news for Sunday, May 19, 1968. John Lennon called Yoko and invited her over for the first time. That was their first time they were together. They dropped acid and they recorded that album, Two Virgins, the one that the cover got censored. And then later they consummated their relationship, which I'm not going to get into the details of that. But I would, some would argue that that day was the beginning of the end of the Beatles. Had he not made that phone call, or she was out of town or something, you never know what might have happened. But anyway, movies. That weekend, The Odd Couple opened. And boy, that puts you in the spot. That was so long ago. That was such an innocent time, wasn't it? The Odd Couple. The previous weekend, the opening was 2001: A Space Odyssey. And a month before that was Planet of the Apes. And I remembered when Planet of the Apes finally hit the drive-in, it was playing at the San Pedro drive-in, and my little foursome, it must have been a 3-day weekend, because we went 3 nights in a row to see Planet of the Apes. Well, to this day, I've never seen the movie, but you know. And that week's Life magazine cover story was called "The Generation Gap." Our parents are trying to read the Life magazine. What's this all about? What are these kids up to? I don't understand what they're doing. So May 19, 1968 was in the middle of all of this tumultuous, historic chaos and wonder that was happening. It was 10 days from May 19 until we graduated. Here we were. Now, remember who you were back then. You know, what kind of person were you, you know? But I think we were all, like little birdies, we were perched on the edge of the nest, ready to jump off and test our wings. Some of us would discover we weren't quite ready yet and had a few learning experiences. And some flew all right, but they flew too close to the sun and crashed and burned, you know. But most of us would fly fine and begin on our little journey of life. Now, since that period, we finally got our men onto the moon, walking on the moon. That same summer was Woodstock, early 70s, Watergate. In the 80s, the outbreak of AIDS, which pretty much threw cold water on the whole sexual revolution. By the late 80s, we saw the fall of communism. And then here comes cable TV. Talk about a big change from 4 channels, you know. Then home computers, email, YouTube, Facebook, Netflix, and cell phones. You know, how did we ever live without cell phones and Google, you know? And then all of our own personal events that happened as well. But you know, think about it. With all the unexpected, the glorious moments, the deep sorrows, as Jerry Garcia would say, what a long, strange trip it's been. And I think, I like the movie, and I think most of us can relate to Forrest Gump. Just the things that he saw, you know, we were there. We'd been there and done that. I didn't play ping pong against the Chinese, but, you know, there was a lot there. So I say let's lift a toast and celebrate who we are and how great a life we've lived. We're in our late 60s, right? How many people are 68 years old? You know, the class of 1968 and you're 68, is that a coincidence? And you figure out, is there any other year that they could say that they, well, do the math. By now, many of us are retired. I mean, who all's retired? You know? The balance of our lives have been wonderful. You know, laughs, loves, dances, hugs, sunsets. And, of course, there have been some bad times and tragedies. But many of us have wonderful children and some grandchildren. We found peace with our demons, and we found strategies to make day-to-day life easier. And our stew has become very tasty indeed. And I think most of us can ultimately say the best word to describe our lives is wonderful. Now look around the room. Will we ever meet again? Will there be more reunions? Is 50 the end of the road or what? We'll talk about that. But look at the people around you. It's quite certain that there are many people here tonight you'll never see again, you know, for whatever reason. That was one of my favorite laugh lines, you know. Now, I would invite you to visit the board, the people who have passed on, and we should keep them in our memories. There's some great people on that board. So I would ask that for the rest of this evening, you take a moment to give your special friends a big hug and say a kind word to everyone you speak to, because you just don't know who you'll never see again, right? That applies to everybody. And I would say give a wink and a nod and a tip of the hat to that young person you were 50 years ago. You know, about to graduate, maybe a little naive and a little scared, standing on the brink of your rest of your life, having no idea. I had no idea what was ahead of me, you know, when I was 17 years old. And it's been a hell of a journey. So be proud and grateful you're a member of the wild, wonderful, very exclusive, and historic class of 68. We are mighty, we are great, we're the class of 68.